Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 111 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today I have with me Virna Di Palma. Virna is the Senior Director of Global Strategy and Communication at Trace. She is going to visit with us about the Trace Matrix. It is a new service offered by Trace. It gives measurements of various bribery indices within a country. She talks about how it was developed and how you may be able to use it going forward. The episode comes in at about 23 minutes. I hope you enjoy the episode. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I am Tom Fox, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have back with me Virna Di Palma. Virna is with Trace, and she's here to share with us some exciting news that recent development or recent product release or service release or something released by Trace. So let's just get right into it. Virna, thanks a lot. First of all, could you tell the folks what your role is with Trace?
Sure, and Tom, thanks for having me back on your show. I really appreciate the invitation. So I am the Senior Director of Global Strategy and Communications at Trace, and that's a pretty broad title and role. So to break it down in a digestible way, I kind of look at my role from three different perspectives. I manage all of our global teams, which are now in India, Dubai, the Philippines, Latin America. And then I also manage all of our communications and outreach and special projects, such as the one that I will introduce today. And finally, I manage and oversee our Trace Anti-Bribery Specialist Accreditation Program. So I certainly have my hands full.
You know, it sounds like we actually need three different podcasts to go over those three in some detail. But I really was thrilled to find out about the Trace Matrix. It's a new product or service offering and maybe a combination of both, but you guys were gracious enough to share with me a webinar that you released when you made the public announcement, and I was so taken aback by what Trace has put together, I asked if you guys could come on to describe it. So with that, tell us what is the Trace Matrix?
Sure. So we are incredibly excited about the Trace Matrix, which essentially is the first global business bribery risk index developed for the compliance community. It's designed to assess the propensity for public sector bribery and its associated business risks, and essentially to provide companies with actionable intelligence to inform their compliance procedures and risk assessment process. It is free and publicly available. It supports our mission to advance commercial transparency globally. We developed it in partnership with RAND Corporation, mainly because we thought it was important to involve a neutral third party, and also because of their stellar reputation as a research institution. Essentially, we developed the Trace Matrix in response to requests from our member companies for the last 3 or 4 years for us to develop a tool to assist with the risk assessment process.
I'm glad you said it very early on, because I was going to say it, and I'm going to continue to say it throughout this podcast. It's free. And this is a tool that's available. It's on the website, and I can't emphasize that enough as to what this brings to the compliance community in terms of its availability. So maybe with that, you could go into a deep dive on what you guys did to develop it, and then what does it show to the compliance practitioner that's perhaps not available, aggregated in one form in another location.
Sure, and just to add just a couple of comments to why we developed the Trace Matrix. Tom, as you know, Trace International is a nonprofit anti-bribery business association, and for the last decade, we've been working to develop practical and cost-effective tools, not only for our member companies, but for the wider compliance community. And we really identified a need for compliance officers to have additional tools to conduct risk assessments. As you know, this is sort of a recent focus areas for companies. Just last week, we heard Patrick Stokes of the DOJ at the ACI FCPA conference say that they really do expect companies to adopt a very thoughtful approach to the risk assessment process. So we worked with our member companies to really determine how to develop a very practical tool that they could use to essentially advance and further the risk assessment process. So with that, so what exactly does the TRACE matrix measure, and what really makes it unique? So the TRACE matrix provides an overall risk score for each country, and that risk score is comprised of domains and subdomain scores. So the four main domains that feed into that final risk score is, number one, business interactions with government. So, for example, procedures to build a warehouse, procedures to obtain licenses and permits, the burden of customs procedures. Number two, anti-bribery laws and enforcement. This one is fairly obvious. So, are there anti-bribery regulations on the books? Are they effectively enforced? If there's an anti-corruption agency, how is it motivated? Is it politically motivated? Is it effective? Number three, government and civil service transparency. So, for example, are there regulations on conflicts of interest? And finally, the capacity for civil society oversight, which includes things such as freedom of the press. So those four main domains are comprised of 9 domains. I gave a few examples there, but essentially we then looked at the best data available for these 4 main elements that we identified as the main areas that contribute to business bribery risk. So to be precise, we have 64 complete indicators, or in other words, data sources that we use to compile the information. We, of course, recognize that there is a multitude of data available on governance, risk, and corruption out there, but we didn't feel that all of those sources were obviously appropriate for what we were trying to achieve. So we developed a set of criteria for the data that we were looking to compile. So, for example, the robustness of the data, is it free from known biases, country coverage, how long the data has been available, if it will continue to be available, just to name a few. Then we combine that data together through an aggregation process that takes into account the relative contributions of each different factor, so recognizing that not all factors are created equal, which means, for example, domain 1, business interactions with government, we felt and found in our research, obviously, that this, to us was the one that most heavily weighted on business bribery risk. So this is weighted the most heavily of the 4 domains. Anti-bribery laws and enforcement, mainly because of the lack of available data and sort of the different interpretations of what that can mean for business bribery, we weighted that the least heavily, and then domain 3 and 4 are weighted equally. So we then take the scores from the subdomains and the domains and aggregate that up and come up with the final risk score. So in summary, it's essentially a data-driven approach that underlies, and this is the sort of important part, a conceptual framework that we think reflects business bribery risk.
Now, available for analysis by the compliance practitioner, are those subdomains, the data that you had utilized to come up with aggregate scores for the domains available?
Yeah, so that's what I think is incredibly valuable about the TRACE matrix. So if you go on our website, you'll see, the first thing you'll see on the TRACE matrix page is the table of overall risk scores, the country rankings, and then you will see the 4 domain scores. You can then also download a table, which is also free and publicly available, that actually has domain scores for all subdomains. So essentially, companies have 14 total scores that they can look at and analyze and determine, how those different scores and how those different risk areas affect their own compliance and risk assessment procedures.
Virna, before we get into perhaps how it can be used, I'd like to maybe take a step back. You talked about how the format was created, the data that went into it. What was the role of RAND in this? Because you specifically mentioned them as a neutral in this process. What did they bring to this?
So they really did the majority of the actually doing the calculations and the actual methodology and the calculations. So TRACE, we essentially worked with them through developing each domain, through determining what really affects business bribery risk. doing the interviews, doing research, identifying data and the indicators, and they then work through the methodology with our input on what should weigh more, what should weigh less. There are other things behind the methodology that they would probably be better suited to address than I, but there are things like a variance penalty for countries that score particularly high in one domain. And there is also multiple imputation. It's the same approach that the US Census uses to estimate scores in the presence of missing data. But those are 2 points that they could explain better than I could.
One of the factors was I'm going to rephrase this as essentially business or government touch points that businesses have to engage in. And I find that particularly appropriate because people as diverse as the FCPA professor, the Department of Justice, and other commentators have pointed to every time you have a government interaction, whether it's to obtain phone service, whether it's to secure a contract, and everything else in between, as an important part of your anti-bribery, anti-corruption analysis. And you guys have put that right up front as the most important factor.
Yeah, and we've been hearing the same thing, and obviously in our own experience here, we've identified that's really the highest risk area. So what I find fascinating is you can sort of look through and see the countries where, there's just a multitude of red tape to get through, and in other countries where it's not as bad. And then interestingly enough, you see a country with a high risk score, and it's not necessarily because of the first domain, but we certainly put that particular factor up front.
Could I now turn to how a compliance officer or even a business person might be able to use the trace matrix?
Sure. So, what we had been hearing and what we know from our own experience is really for information on corruption to be readily accessible for a company and practical. It really needs to apply to their industry and how they go to market, and they need to understand what is driving an overall risk score for a country. So it's not enough to say, okay, this country is high risk. So using the trace matrix, a company can go in and again see the different scores for the domains and the subdomains and determine where the highest levels of risk are and what's driving that overall risk score. So to give an example, if they're looking at a country with a high score in domain 4, which is capacity for civil society oversight, and potentially a high score in domain 3, which is transparency of governments and civil service, that would essentially indicate that government officials can make bribe demands with relative impunity. So a company could respond by investing more in training employees to respond to those bribe demands, to potentially looking at working with local embassies or industry groups to address bribe demands in specific departments. The other example that we essentially already touched upon, so of course with all of the countries in a very high score in domain 1, business interactions with government, and those do break down into 3 other subdomains where companies can sort of dig deeper at the scores and see where some of the more problematic areas might be. A company can, of course, build more time into their projects for obtaining licenses, permits, and clearing goods through customs. So again, understanding where the risks lie and where they should be investing their compliance resources and how they should be looking at their risk assessment procedure. And again, we've heard from the DOJ that they're looking for this type of granularity and this more precise approach to determining country risk.
And you really touched upon why I think the trace matrix is such an incredibly valuable tool and perhaps even a game changer. And if I could explain it, you have given the compliance practitioner information which allows them to move from detection, and I even think past prevention, to prescription, because you've identified issues that would allow a compliance practitioner to deliver a risk management solution to a known, identified, and quantified risk. So that's what I really saw that when I saw the presentation by Alexandra and yourself. That's what really struck me is, wow, I now know what I need to do, what tools I can bring to bear for the risks that may appear in this country.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we're hoping companies will do. I mean, we realize that there may be some companies who simply look at that overall risk score and sort of continue to approach risk assessments the way they have always been. But we hope that they're, for the majority of companies are really kind of digging deep and looking at this information. And so far, the response from our member companies has been fantastic. Compliance officers are really interested in looking at this information in great detail and understanding how it can help them improve their risk assessment process.
Now let me turn to how this particular tool might be different than others. And I think most people are aware and probably even comfortable with the use of the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. Certainly I use it, talk to clients about it quite a bit. There's a lot of level of sophistication of what information a tool like that brings. My first question is, if a country has a higher or lower score on the trace matrix than the TICPI, what might have caused that to occur?
Sure. So to address your first question generally, so the main difference, of course, between the trace matrix and not only the TICPI, but other indices out there like the World Governance Index, is that, again, we have the real value here is that we have leveraged our own experience, the experience of in-house counsel, of anti-bribery compliance professionals, and of RAND to really come up with a conceptual framework for business bribery risk. And we're using hard data to come up with the results. Other indices, they have really put this issue on the map, and they are a great utility to companies and the wider community. But they're based on, more general, broad corruption, and not all of the areas that they are looking into may really affect business bribery risk or be relevant for the private sector. And further, many of them are based on perceptions either by experts or by the general population. So that's what really distinguishes the trace matrix from other indices out there. And we believe that, there may be companies that say, great, this is a more practical tool and we'll use this for our risk assessments going forward. But on the flip side, we also see it as a complementary tool. There may be many companies who are looking now at the different indices out there to make their own analysis and assessment of country risk based on, their industry and the way that they go to market. Going to your second question on the different scores, that is certainly to be expected. I think it's important to note that the correlation between the trace matrix and TICPI is 0.83, which certainly indicates a relationship stronger than random, but less than perfect. So if you do a comparison of the scores, there will be many countries that are pretty similar across the board, which I think in a sense is reassuring for companies and just provides them with more confidence of what a risk level might be in a certain jurisdiction. Now, there are many countries that have very different scores, so I'll give a couple of examples to really illustrate how it works. So India, for example, in the TICPI score 64, and this is if we're inverting and rescaling the scores so that it's the same scale.
Right.
And the trace matrix, it scores an 80. So obviously it ranks as higher risk in the trace matrix. And the main reason for that is because of the high score in domain 1. They have a score of 92 in domain 1, which is essentially driving the overall risk score. So another example would be Brazil, the score of 58 in the TICPI and a score of 69 in the trace matrix. And again, here we're looking at a high score in domain 1, not as high as India. It's at 77 in Brazil, but again, it's affecting that overall score. And then to give an example of a country which is actually rated as lower risk in the trace matrix, we have Indonesia, which scores 68 in the CPI, 51 in the trace matrix. And interestingly enough, this is because of a low score in domain 1 and then relatively moderate scores across the board. So those are specific examples, but again, more generally, if you see a different score, it's mainly because we're using a different conceptual framework and approach, so we're not looking at the same issues.
Well, I was actually in the middle of writing tomorrow's blog before I gave you a call on Skype, and I'm writing about India. So that was at the forefront of my mind, and I'm really glad you gave that example because that's really one of the prime examples across the globe where someone like the professor, FCPA professor, might say barriers to free trade or barriers to even coming into the country I think the U.S. government might say lots of government touch points for licenses and permits, and you have that as domain one. So very interesting and a great analysis. The other observation I would make is that as with both you and I, as we matured in our compliance profession and our compliance knowledge, Trace has matured, companies have matured, the Department of Justice and SEC have matured, and I see really the Trace matrix as part of that maturity process where we're going from scores that indicate a perception of corruption in certain geographic areas and other indices to something that integrates a much more rounded and holistic approach of various touch points, even to including the press and freedom of the press to be able to report on corruption of politicians is an important now part of the dialogue. So I see this as a maturity of Trace, the maturity of the profession, a maturity of the industry. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And in my own experience and the experience of Trace, yeah, there's been a pretty dramatic evolution in the last decade and in the way that companies approach compliance. And really, again, risk assessments have been at the forefront of compliance now for the last 2-3 years, if not more than that, with DOJ and now increasingly other regulators really, highlighting the need for a risk-based approach, and companies really want to understand how they can do that in practical terms. And I think it's evolved to where, just having that plugging in one number and saying, well, this is the score, this is the risk, and that's it. That's really not enough. The DOJ, the SEC, they're looking for a more thoughtful analysis, and the Trace Matrix certainly allows them to do so. And in our own experience at Trace, we always say we'd love to say that all of our ideas are our own, but we work very closely with our member companies to really understand what sort of tools they need, to really understand what can help them advance and improve their compliance procedures. And this was, the number one thing that we had been hearing for the last 3 or 4 years. So, this whole project took about 1.5 years. And we started the conversation with RAND maybe 2 years ago. So it was, we were thinking about it for a long time, and then we thought, okay, it's about time to do this.
Well, I think it's a great addition to Trace. It's a great addition to the compliance community, and it's going to be an even greater addition for the compliance professional and their individual companies. If I could end with a couple of direct questions. First of all, if someone was listening to this and wanted to go to find out more about the Matrix, where would they go?
So they would go just to the Trace International webpage, so www.traceinternational.org. And in the top right-hand side of the page, you'll see a little tab for the Matrix. It will take you to the Matrix page, which will have the table. You'll be able to download the RAND report, which I do encourage everyone to read, as well as the full table with the domain scores. And also a Q&A. And actually, one final thing I forgot to mention that's available on the website is a guide to the country reports. So it's another document that companies can download. It's essentially a roadmap for analyzing the information in each of the country reports, which leads me to another point I forgot to mention about the website. What is great about the table as well is when you look at the overall table of risk scores, you can click on each country and you'll be able to download the full country report with the scores as well.
And then finally, if I could ask if anyone wanted to follow up with you, could they email you? And if so, how would they do it?
Yes, absolutely. So anyone can email me directly at dipalma, DIPALMA, at traceinternational.org. And I'd be happy to further address any of these questions.
Well, Virna, I can't thank you enough for coming on and describing this just fabulous new tool that's been made available by Trace. And I'm going to say it one more time. It is absolutely free. So if you are listening to this, after you finish, go to the Trace website and take a look at it, because it's going to be a great tool for you going forward. Thank you again.
Tom, thanks so much for your support.
All right.